I'm Scott Allen Miller, and this is Sam IT. Today, we're going to talk about the Orbital Company. This is a little bit weird one, and I used this term at MangoCon recently, but it's an idea that I've proposed for a long time. In a normal business, we have businesses that are succeeding, those that are making money, growing, doing what their mission is, and we have those that are failing, and over time will go out of business. Most businesses will go out of business within the first decade, actually quite a bit more dramatic than that. However, there is an entire category of business that is neither succeeding nor will completely go out of business, possibly ever, or for a dramatically long time. And I call these orbital businesses. Why orbital? Well, we have to look at what an orbit is. In physics, something that is orbiting is in a continuous state of falling. Right? This is how orbiting works. You get moving around a celestial body like a planet, and you move forward at a pace just fast enough to keep you from actually having a deteriorating orbit and crashing. So you end up in freefall forever, or at least a really, really long time. And there are a large number of companies, especially in the SMB space, that act this way. Now, how can this be? What does it mean to constantly fail and yet not completely fail? Obviously, if you had huge coffers with billions of dollars in the bank and lost $1 million a month, you could do it for years. That's fine, and that's not what we mean. What we mean is that we have a company that as a company is failing, but somehow is being artificially propped up. A very common example of this is the owner-funded company, and this is really common, especially with doctors, because doctors tend to have high incomes, are wealthy enough, and have a relatively guaranteed income stream enough to make opening their own business relatively easy, but typically have very little training in business and are busy being doctors, not running the business, because if they just ran the business, there wouldn't be any sense to them being a doctor. They'd be too busy doing something else. So we have a tendency for doctor-owned businesses to kind of ignore the business side and actually lose money. Now, we say lose money, that's a relative term. In absolute terms, they might make money. They might bring it in, but they don't bring it in at a pace necessary to pay everyone, primarily the owner, at the rate that they should be paid had they not owned the business. And this is where it's important. At some point under the hood, somewhere, sometimes it's incredibly overt, and sometimes it's incredibly hard to see, the owner, or possibly someone else, is funding the company, possibly by simply taking a lower pay than they should be getting. And a common way to see this is if we have a doctor who in the private sector might earn, we'll say, $300,000 a year. From their own business, they decide to take a salary of, let's say, $100,000 a year. That sounds like they're losing $200,000. But the company then makes profits and they take profit sharing on the back end. Let's say they take $50,000 later. Now they're making $150,000 a year instead of $300,000. That means that they're essentially donating $150,000 per year into the business to keep it running. That means it's actually, in the grand scheme of things, taking a $150,000 loss each year as an overall entity, but it's orbital. It can do this forever because that doctor can continue to fund it indefinitely. When the doctor retires, he'll just shut down the business. It won't fail, it'll just be decommissioned. This happens with all kinds of businesses, especially nonprofits. With a nonprofit, we often see the entire staff doing this, with a normal salary maybe being $80,000 a year, but people are willing to work for a nonprofit for $50,000 or $60,000. Of course, nonprofits are a different animal, and we don't want to think of them as failing just because they don't make money, but it doesn't change the fact that financially they're in an orbital state in many cases. But this happens across the board, all kinds of businesses. Owners do it often, and we can see it in all sectors. But lots of time, other staff do it as well, especially in the small business space. You'll have employees who are willing to take lower salary, maybe because they believe in the mission, maybe because they just like the company, maybe because they want to support the owner. Whatever the reason, we often find people who are willing to work at a lowered rate in order to keep a business going that if they were to be paid at their full rate, or if the company was to pay for all the things it should probably pay for, they would not be able to keep the company functional. It would lose money too quickly and go out of business. So they're being artificially kept in orbit, and they can do it indefinitely. right? It's called an orbital business because this is sustainable. It doesn't mean that the company is actually making everyone money the way that it hopes, but it can keep operating forever. It's important to identify these things when we're working anywhere, but especially in IT, because whether we're internal IT staff, we need to know if our company has the potential to grow, or if we're going to be asked to do a little bit more than we should, put in a few extra hours, not get paid for them just to keep the company functioning, and maybe we're willing to do that, but it's important to realize that it's happening and why. And it's important to know when we're looking at jobs, is this something we want to do? Do we want to be involved in an orbital corporation rather than one that's growing, or at least has a good potential to grow, or one that's simply taking risks and going to go out of business? Knowing these categories, all of them are fine. It's just important for you to know how it affects your career potential. And the same thing if you're an MSP or an ITSP, knowing that you have customers that are orbital, that may be perfectly fine as long as they're paying their bills. Great, and you can just gauge what their needs are. Orbital companies typically need cost savings at any cost, right? As long as they stay functional, investing in advancements probably is a waste for them, whereas a company that's growing, just cost savings is probably a waste for them. These perceptions will matter regardless of what your role is in IT. Thanks for joining me today. Remember to like and subscribe and comment below. Do you work for an orbital company? How is it being propped up? Do they have hopes of breaking that orbit? Escape velocity is possible, but rare. Once companies go into that orbital mode, it takes a pretty big shakeup, maybe a new CEO or something, typically, to be able to break out of that orbital status. And of course, when trying to do so, they may crash and burn. Thanks for joining me.